Hi, welcome back to Gen Z Bible class, where today we're going to continue on in the exciting story of the life of Abraham. I want to finish up something that we sort of left undone from chapter 19. And you'll remember the last thing we talked about was the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Not a very pretty sight, or not a very happy story, but we sort of left Lot, if you'll remember, that he and his wife and his two daughters were encouraged to leave as quickly as they could because of this impending destruction that was coming. And of course, we have the whole story about Lot's wife turning around and turning into a pillar of salt. I guess she decided she really didn't want to leave all of her riches back there in Sodom, her nice house and everything that she owned. And in a way you could understand that, because just within a matter of a few hours, this whole thing falls upon them, and they're required to leave. Well, anyway, what ends up happening with Lot after all of this? Now it's just him and his two daughters. And chapter 19 sort of ends by giving us a picture of where Lot ends up. And I think we can learn some important lessons when we consider everything that he did, the decisions he made, and how he ends up losing pretty much everything. So this is in verse 30 of chapter 19. Lot and his two daughters left Zoar and settled in the mountains, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. He and his two daughters lived in a cave. Talk about stepping down in society. They went from living in a mansion, or probably the equivalent to a mansion back then, with servants and people to take care of them. And now Lot has lost his wife. His two daughters have lost their intended husbands, and they're living in a cave. I mean, talk about a drastic change. Lot, and it also says that they left Zoar. If you remember, they asked the angels to be able to hide out in this little town of Zoar, so that they didn't think they'd make it to the mountains. So as a result, Zoar is saved. But I'm sure that the people of Zoar weren't too happy with Lot, because they associated him with the destruction of all their neighbors down there in Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot ends up in a pretty bad place, and it even gets a little worse, and I'll tell you why. This is how the whole story ends. It's a very curious little part of the story. In verse 32, one day the older daughter said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is no man around here to give us children, as is the custom over all the earth. Let's get our father to drink wine, and then sleep with him, and preserve our family line through our father." Whoa, that doesn't sound like such a good idea, does it? But again, as before, we have to remember the culture and the time that they were living in. And in that time, for a woman to have no children, they didn't have a social security. They didn't have grocery stores where you can just go buy stuff if you needed it. You were dependent upon each other, and families were much closer together because they were so dependent on each other. The children depended on the mothers to care for them, and when the children get older, they are, taught to work, and they have to contribute to the family income. And of course, guys like Lot, who were the heads of the household, had to kind of run everything. And for a woman in that culture to be stuck with no possibility of having a child is a really big, serious thing. So it seems like kind of a strange plan that they come up with, but the bottom line is it worked, for better or for worse. And the other really interesting thing about this is that their children, the older daughter has a son, and he actually becomes the progenitor of a whole people group called the Moabites. And the youngest daughter also has a son, and of course through this deception of Lot, and her children become the Ammonites. And you read more about them in the Bible. They show up again. So you see, just in this one decision, these two whole people groups are basically born through that one decision. I guess there's probably a lesson there about, making the right decisions. It seems like this is a big deal because the decisions you make have a way of resounding through time and becoming more and more important as time goes on. So this is, and really what we're going to be looking at here is like three little stories, or four little stories. This is one of them, and this is how chapter 19 ends, and it brings us to the, I guess you could say, the end, the eulogy for our friend Lot, because we don't hear anything more about him. So we leave him living in a cave, unfortunately, in a very sad ending, the result of some bad decision making. Well, what's the next thing that happens? Well, we remember that the angels had come and told Abraham and Sarai that they were going to have this kid. And sure enough, it happens. And this is the next thing that we read about. And we're going to get now to chapter 20 and read the first verse to see what's happening there. Now, Abraham moved on from there into the region of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. For a while he stayed in Gerar, and there Abraham said of his wife Sarah, "She is my sister." And then Abimelech, the king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her. Now, does that sound familiar to you? Because that's exactly what happened when Abraham went into Egypt. And remember, Pharaoh saw, of course, Sarah was a lot younger then, and Pharaoh saw her and he said, "This is a beautiful woman, I'm going to take her." And Abraham had come up with this plan. It's interesting. It tells us that Abraham had told Sarah when they left, when they first got married, and they left for Canaan from the land of Ur. This was a plan that he told her that they were going to do if they ever ran into this situation. So this has been, I guess, part of the master plan all along. But as a result, now Abimelech takes Sarai. Now, why did they have to move to begin with? I guess that's a good question. Why at this point? It seemed like things were going pretty well there. They were, living in this beautiful grove of trees there in Marmara, and it seemed like everything was okay. But there's some possible reasons why they left. One of them could have just been a very practical reason that after Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, it probably wasn't a really nice place to live. I mean, there were dead people and there were fire and brimstone and, maybe the smell of burning, who knows, would have made living in, closer to that area impossible. It's also possible, just like we said with Lot, that Abraham's reputation might not have been that great in that area because people would make the connection between the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah and knowing that Abraham had something to do with that. Maybe it wasn't safe for him to stay in that area. Another maybe more practical reason, and maybe this is hopefully the other reason he left, is because remember they're living a nomadic lifestyle, and so you run out of pasture land and you got to move somewhere else. And that could have been also, maybe that's a more reasonable way to understand why he would have left. But the result is he comes to this new area. The king Abimelech, who is the king of that area, takes his wife, takes what he thinks is his sister, and the way, to make a long story short, the Lord reveals to Abimelech in a dream that, hey, this woman that you took was Abraham's wife. And it turns out that things aren't going so well for Abimelech because none of his other wives are bearing children for him. So I'm not real sure, what the time period was here, but he knows that something is wrong, and then finally God reveals the truth to him. Well, he goes to Abraham and he says, "Why in the world did you do this?" Well, Abraham sort of explains, this was our strategy and this was our plan all along. And the end result was, again, very similar to what happened in Egypt. If you remember, Pharaoh just dumped all these gifts on Abraham before he left to go back to Canaan in Egypt. And that's essentially what happens here with Abimelech. We read about that in Genesis 20:14. Then Abimelech brought sheep and cattle and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham, and he returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, "My land is before you. Live wherever you like." And in addition to that, he gives Sarah 1,000 talents of silver to give to her, quote, brother, or really husband. So Abraham walks away, with his pockets full once again, in spite of the fact that we can't really say that this whole plan of his, this deceptive plan was necessarily a good thing. But one of the things we do see is God continues to pour out his blessing on Abraham. Because even though, maybe he doesn't always make the best decisions, very much like Lot, at least his heart is to follow and obey God. When we think about somebody like Lot, I'm not so sure. I think maybe just having money was a lot more important to him than his relationship with God or his spiritual condition. So, next story. Okay, so that was one story about Lot and his daughters. The next story here about how Abraham moved into this new area and kind of made a connection with Abimelech and the people there. The next thing that happens is we actually have happy birthday to Isaac, because he is born in Genesis. Now we're in Genesis 21, so we're kind of moving along here. In verse 6, Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and anyone who hears about this will laugh with me." And she added, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." So you have this, you can only imagine how happy it must have made them to actually have this child that they've been waiting for years and years and years. And Sarah, we talked about the laugh, how Sarah had laughed when the angels told her that this was going to happen, because it seemed so impossible. And this was just her, being happy about the situation. So at this point, it seems like Abraham and Sarah are in really good shape. They've made this alliance with the king Abimelech, and they're settled in. And probably that was a good thing too, because if you're a woman and you want to have you're expecting a child, the last thing you want to do is to be, have your household disrupted and to be in a process of moving. I remember one time I had to get a house ready for someone who was going to be moving in, and the baby was due, and you don't always know when those kids are coming, and so we kind of scrambled to get everything ready for them, and fortunately everything was ready for this lady who was having the kid, but it seemed like things were going pretty well in terms of now them being settled. Sarah has an established home. Well, I guess they were still living in tents, but she had a tent that was in a more permanent place, and now she's ready to have this kid. The kid comes, and it's just such a happy time, except for one thing. And this is the next story, the next part of the story, where Hagar and Ishmael come back into the scene of things. And we read about that in verse 9 of chapter 21. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." And this was a big deal back then. I mean, remember, we're talking about a different culture, and the fact that the oldest son was the one that would stand to inherit everything from the father. So Ishmael might have grown up, with this idea in his head. Well, I'm the first son. I'm the one that deserves to receive the inheritance. And when this pesky little brother Isaac, or half-brother Isaac, shows up, his whole dream might be dissolving. So he's not very happy. And he ends up mocking this little baby. Well, what do you think Sarah's going to think about that? Well, just like before, remember, she had already sent them away one time. But God brought them back. And this time, she insists that they leave, and this time they do leave, and they end up leaving for good. Now this, from Abraham's perspective, this wasn't a very happy thing, but I think he understood that it was something that had to happen because he loved his son Ishmael. And, by this time Ishmael is, I don't know, a young man, and, Abraham and he had been hanging out for many years, and I'm sure Abraham was very sad to see him go. But the interesting thing is that God reassured Abraham that he was going to take care of Ishmael. And that's exactly what happened. Hagar and Ishmael end up, running away, and they find themselves in a totally destitute situation, and she had just set him aside as a, because she didn't want to see him die, and they didn't have any water, but an angel appeared to them, and the angel pointed out this well that was close by, so they survived. She ends up finding a wife for Ishmael, and from Egypt. Remember, she was Egyptian herself. And so the Lord assures Abraham that everything's going to be okay. And it's interesting, and here's another situation where the descendants of this one person become a whole people group. And the descendants of Ishmael become all the Arab people today. So it's interesting how we can look at people groups today and trace their ancestry back to some of these very early forefathers, I guess you could say. So God assures Abraham, and it seems now, once he gets, this whole issue with Ishmael ironed out, one more thing happens. And this is where we kind of leave Abraham at the end of his life, except for one more really big thing that happens we'll be talking about next time. But we look at Genesis 21:22. God is with you, says Abimelech to Abraham, in everything you do. Now swear to me before God that you will not deal falsely with me, nor my children, or my descendants. Show to me in the country where you now reside as a foreigner the same kindness I have shown to you. So Abimelech approaches Abraham one more time. And remember, I think Abimelech has a tremendous amount of respect for Abraham, and maybe a little bit of concern, because he knows Abraham is a very powerful person, all by himself. We remember that he had, this army that went out to rescue Lot, and so he must have been maybe a little concerned and wanted to establish peace with Abraham. So he makes this treaty, and within this treaty, and maybe that was actually one of the reasons why he wanted to take Sarah into his household, because of this alliances that people would make back then. If you had a member of this person's household in your household, you wouldn't have to worry about them attacking you, because you were kind of a blended family at that point. That might have been some of his reason for taking Sarah, as we said. But he's concerned, and he wants to make a treatment. He wants a treaty with Abraham, and the interesting thing is, the first thing he says is that God is with you in everything you do. And I think there were a lot of people that noticed that about Abraham. And people who are close to God have, sometimes good reputations amongst people. We could see that in the story of Daniel, which comes along, quite some time later. That Daniel was a godly young man, and he was taken to Babylon, and the people in Babylon could see how he was so much smarter and so much healthier than all the other Babylonian young men that he was being trained with. So this isn't the first time that we've seen God's blessing, people being aware of God's blessing on someone's life. And Abimelech knew there was something very special about Abraham, and that's why he made this treaty with him. There was a little issue about a well, and Abraham said, we have dug this well, and some of your guys, your shepherds, are taking water from our well. And they came up with an agreement, and Abraham gave Abimelech some, I think, 7 rams in order to settle that whole dispute. So I think there's a lesson there in that, the Bible tells us as much as is possible, we should live at peace with each other. And, Abraham wasn't the kind of guy that wanted to conquer the world. He just wanted to find a place where he could live and prosper. And I think that's a good example to set for us. But what is the overall thing? And we talked about these four little different stories here within, these few chapters, which kind of wrap up Abraham's life. I think the lesson, maybe, if there's an overall lesson here, it has to do with the decisions that you make. And we can see how making a bad decision, like Lot did, caused him to lose everything that he had. And he went from being very prosperous, he's hanging out with his uncle Abraham, and they were both very wealthy, so wealthy that they had to split up because they didn't have enough land to take care of all their animals. And I'm sure he was a wealthy man there in Sodom, but he wasn't really in tune with the culture or the people, and finally God's judgment comes, and he ends up, I guess you could say, receiving the fair benefits of his bad decision to move there in the first place. But if you compare him to Abraham, now Abraham didn't always do everything right, but as we said, God blessed him because he had a heart to follow God. Everything that he did, he tried to honor God. And there's one more really big story that we're going to be ending with. I've been alluding to it, but I promise you next time we're going to get to this story that happens towards the very end of Abraham's life. But we leave him now. It says that Abraham, in verse 33, planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he called on the name of the Lord, the eternal God, and Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines for a long time. And it just seems like now we're leaving Abraham in a good situation. And, whenever you get to retirement, you want to be in a good situation. You don't have to worry about finding food and, dealing with all the issues of life. And Abraham finds himself in this really good place, and it's all a result of God's blessing. So I hope that this isn't just Bible stories to you. It's not just stories about history, but these are stories that illustrate principles that are true, always will be true. And they can be meaningful to us as well when we think about decisions that we're making. Gen Z, you're at the age when you're making a lot of really big decisions. Who am I going to marry? What kind of career am I going to have? How am I going to live my life? And all of those decisions are going to reap some sort of, blessing or problem, depending on the kind of decisions you make and making the right decisions. So I hope that if you didn't learn anything else or remember anything else, just remember that. And as I said, next time we're going to be talking about another really big challenge of faith in the life of Abraham. So I hope you're able to join us then on Gen Z Bible Class.